I called my grandson every day and I got no answer for 6 days. Then I got the answer and it was the last one I expected. The morning my daughter drove me to the airport, she kept adjusting the mirror even though the road was straight, and she reached over twice to pat my hand like she was checking I was still there. I'd raised her better than to fidget, so I noticed. She parked, walked me all the way to the security line, and hugged me for a beat longer than a hug usually lasts. "This is going to be so good for you, Dad," she said into my shoulder. "You've earned a real rest." I laughed and told her I wasn't made of glass, that a week at a lake house wasn't going to fix or break anything. She pulled back and looked at me with her mother's green eyes, searching my face like she was trying to remember it. "I love you," she said. "Whatever happens, I love you." I told her she was being dramatic and to get back to work before she got a parking ticket. I should have known then. A man who's lived 71 years learns to read a room, and I'd read that one wrong on purpose, because the alternative was too ugly to consider. My name is Walter Combs, and for 40 years I ran an accounting firm out of a converted house on 5th Street in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. I built that business from a card table and a phone line into something with my name on the door and 11 employees who called me at Christmas. My wife, Doris, died 4 years ago of a stroke that took her in 11 minutes flat, no warning, no goodbye, just gone between one cup of coffee and the next. My daughter Rachel had been wonderful through all of it. She'd moved back to town, helped me sort through Doris's things, sat with me through the worst of the nights when the house felt like a museum of a life that had ended. I trusted her the way you trust your own hands. The flight to Michigan was smooth, and I spent most of it thinking about the lake. Rachel had described it in detail: the dock, the loons at dusk, a cabin with a stone fireplace where I could read and fish and let my knees rest from 30 years of standing at a filing cabinet. She'd even told me not to bring a suit, which had made me laugh because when had I ever packed a suit for a lake house? I landed at a small regional airport with exactly 4 gates, and I stood at the baggage claim watching the carousel spin with nothing on it that was mine and no one holding a sign with my name. I waited 40 minutes. I am a patient man. You don't run a business for 4 decades without patience, but 40 minutes of standing on a bad hip, while your bag goes, God knows where, starts to wear on a person. I finally asked an airline employee, a young man with a lanyard and a tired smile, if he could look up my connecting transportation. He didn't understand what I meant, so I showed him the printed itinerary Rachel had put together, the one with the address circled in her neat handwriting. He typed it into his phone and his face did something I didn't like, a kind of careful blankness, the look people get right before they have to tell you something you don't want to hear. "Sir," he said, "this is Fairhaven Senior Living. It's a memory care community. It's not a lake house." I told him he must be looking at the wrong address, that there had to be some mix-up, and he turned his phone around so I could see the map myself, the little red pin sitting right on top of a building 45 minutes away. I called Rachel from the curb outside the terminal, my hands not shaking yet, not quite, because part of me still believed there was an explanation waiting on the other end of the line. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I called her husband, Tom, a man I'd never fully warmed to but tolerated because Rachel loved him. Voicemail. I stood there in the cold with my one suitcase and called my own daughter 6 times in a row like a man drowning who keeps reaching for a rope that isn't there. A woman waiting for a rideshare finally asked if I was all right, and I must have looked bad enough that she offered to call me a cab herself. I gave the driver the address from the itinerary because I didn't know what else to do, and I watched the flat gray fields of northern Michigan slide past the window, and I kept turning the same sentence over in my mind, unable to make it mean anything sensible. My daughter had booked me into a memory care facility and told me it was a lake house. There was no version of that sentence that ended well. Fairhaven was a low brick building with a wraparound porch and a sign in tasteful navy lettering, the kind of place designed to look gentle so that the families dropping people off don't have to feel what they're actually doing. I paid the driver and stood on the walkway with my suitcase, and for a moment I genuinely considered turning around and walking back down the road, as if that would undo whatever this was. Instead, I went inside, because I am a man who finishes what he starts, even when what he's starting is finding out exactly how badly he's been betrayed. The lobby smelled like lemon cleaner and, underneath it, something institutional I couldn't name. A woman in blue scrubs sat with an elderly man at a puzzle table, moving his hand gently toward a piece he kept missing. Another resident stood at the window with her palm flat against the glass, watching the parking lot like she was waiting for someone who wasn't coming. The receptionist looked up, and her face brightened in a way that told me she'd been expecting me. "Mr. Combs," she said warmly, "we've got your room ready. Your daughter said you'd be a little disoriented about the details. Don't worry, that's completely normal for the transition." Disoriented. I asked her what exactly my daughter had told her, and she pulled up a folder with my name typed across the tab, and inside it were papers I had never seen, signed with a signature that was almost mine but not quite, close enough to pass a glance and nowhere close enough to survive a real look. There was a letter, supposedly from my physician of 30 years, describing early-stage cognitive decline, memory lapses, incidents of confusion. I have never had a memory lapse that wasn't just a man in his 70s forgetting where he set his glasses. I told the receptionist as much, calmly, because I had learned a long time ago that rage gets you nowhere with someone who's just doing her job. She looked uncertain, glancing between me and the folder like she was trying to decide which version of reality to believe: the calm, coherent man in front of her, or the paperwork that said he shouldn't be either of those things. "Your daughter left something for you," she said finally, and handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Rachel's handwriting. The same hand that used to write me birthday cards, signed, "Love, your favorite daughter," even though she was my only one. I sat down in a chair by the window, across from the woman with her palm against the glass, and opened it. 2 pages, front and back. "Dad," it began, "I know you're going to be angry, and I understand, but I need you to read this whole thing before you call me screaming." She wrote that Tom's construction business had collapsed 8 months ago, that they were $60,000 behind on their mortgage, that she'd been too ashamed to tell me. She wrote that she'd found paperwork in my study, my will, my accounts, and realized that as my power of attorney, a document I'd signed years ago in case anything ever happened to me suddenly, she technically had authority to act on my behalf if I were deemed unable to manage my own affairs. She wrote that she'd paid a doctor she found online, a man who'd never examined me, to write a letter declaring cognitive decline. She wrote that she'd used that letter to have herself declared my legal guardian, to liquidate part of my retirement accounts, and to put my house, the house Doris and I had lived in for 31 years, on the market that very week. "I'm not a bad person," the letter said. "I just didn't see another way out. You'll be safe here, Dad. You'll be taken care of. And once things are stable, I'll figure out how to make this right." I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket, and I asked the receptionist if I could use a phone in private, because mine, it turned out, had been in Rachel's control long enough that she'd disabled roaming on it before I ever landed one more small cruelty tucked inside the larger one. She showed me to a small office off the lobby. I sat down at the desk and I did what I have done for 40 years when a problem is bigger than my temper. I made a list, and I made calls. I called my attorney, Frank Delacroix, who had drawn up that power of attorney in the first place and who I trusted the way you trust a man who's beaten you at chess for 20 years and never once let you win out of pity. I told him everything. I could hear him go very quiet and very still on the other end, the particular silence of a man doing math in his head. "Walter," he said finally, "I want you to listen to me carefully. A power of attorney doesn't work the way she thinks it does. It doesn't just activate because someone forges a letter. There's a process, and if that process was fraudulent, we can unwind every bit of it, but we need to move today, not tomorrow." He told me he was filing an emergency motion within the hour to freeze the accounts and halt the house sale, and that he was also calling the county's Adult Protective Services and, separately, the sheriff's office, because what Rachel had done wasn't a family disagreement. It was a felony financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery, and fraud, and the fact that I wasn't remotely a vulnerable adult was itself the strongest piece of evidence in the case. I hung up and sat there in that small borrowed office for a long moment, looking at a watercolor of a lighthouse someone had hung on the wall to make the room feel less clinical. I thought about all the nights I'd sat up with Rachel over her algebra homework, all the mornings I'd driven her to swim practice before the sun came up, the 4 years since Doris died when Rachel had been, or so I believed, the one steady thing left in my life. I thought about how a person builds another person, cell by cell and choice by choice, and how that other person can still turn around one day and decide you are an obstacle instead of a father. I had a granddaughter, Rachel's daughter, my granddaughter Mia, who was 24 and living 2 states away in Indianapolis, working as a nurse, someone Rachel and I both loved fiercely and who had never in her life given me a single reason to doubt her. Mia and I talked every Sunday, a standing call that had survived Doris's death, my retirement, everything. It was a Tuesday, so I hadn't planned to call her, but I called her anyway, because I needed to hear a voice that hadn't just tried to erase me. She picked up on the second ring, cheerful, mid-shift break cheerful, and I heard that cheer drop out of her voice the moment I said hello, because I have never once called her outside of our Sunday slot and she knew it instantly for what it was trouble. I told her everything, plainly, the way you'd read someone a weather report, because if I let myself feel it while I was saying it out loud, I wasn't sure I'd get through the telling. There was a long silence on her end, and then she said 4 words that I will remember until the day I die: "I'm coming right now." Fairhaven was 45 minutes from the airport, but only 20 from the interstate that ran up toward Indianapolis, and Mia made that drive in under 2 hours, which for a distance that size meant she never once let the needle drop below 80. I know because she told me later, unrepentant, that she'd gotten a warning from a state trooper who took one look at her face and decided not to write the ticket. She came through the doors of Fairhaven like weather. I hadn't seen my granddaughter move that fast since she was 9 years old, racing me to the mailbox. She found me still sitting in that little office, and she didn't say anything at first. She just wrapped her arms around my neck and held on, and I felt something in my chest that had been clenched since the baggage carousel finally started to loosen. "I've got you, Grandpa," she said. "Nobody is putting you anywhere you don't want to be." It took her 20 minutes of pure, controlled fury at the front desk to get the paperwork sorted, to show my genuine identification, to make 3 separate staff members understand that the man in front of them was neither confused nor a resident and had never consented to being either. The director of the facility came out at one point, apologetic in the careful way of someone worried about liability, and explained that they had followed the paperwork they'd been given in good faith. I believed her. It didn't make the last 6 hours hurt any less, but I believed her, and I told her so, because misplaced trust isn't the same crime as manufactured deceit. Mia drove me to her apartment that night, and I called Frank from her passenger seat somewhere on I-69 to get the latest, and he told me the freeze on the accounts had gone through, that the house sale was halted pending investigation, that Adult Protective Services had already opened a file, and that a detective wanted to speak with me the following morning. I should have felt triumphant. Mostly, I just felt tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. The next 5 days were a blur of depositions and paperwork, and Mia's small apartment smelling like coffee at all hours, because neither of us was sleeping well. The detective, a soft-spoken woman named Renata Osei, walked me through what they'd found. Rachel had been in far deeper financial trouble than even her letter admitted. Tom's business hadn't just failed, it had failed while owing money to 2 subcontractors who were threatening a lawsuit, and Rachel had been quietly siphoning from her own retirement account for months before she ever touched mine, trying to plug a hole that kept getting bigger. The forged doctor's letter had come from a man in another state who was already under investigation for selling fraudulent medical documentation online, meaning Rachel wasn't even his only customer, which was, in its own bleak way, almost a relief, because it meant this hadn't been some singular act of genius cruelty aimed only at me. It was something sadder and more common than that. Rachel called Mia's phone 11 times over those 5 days. I didn't answer any of them. I wasn't ready, and Mia, God bless her, never once told me I should be. On the 6th day, Rachel was arrested, at her home in front of her own 2 children, my grandson Eli, who was 16, and my granddaughter Josie, who was 12. Mia told me later, gently, because she thought I should know even though it hurt to hear, that Josie had called her crying, asking why the police had taken Mommy away, and Mia hadn't known what to tell a 12-year-old that was both true and survivable. I sat with that for a long time. Whatever Rachel had done to me, her children hadn't done anything, and somewhere underneath my anger was a colder, harder grief for what this was going to cost 2 kids who'd already lost one grandmother and were now losing, in a different and messier way, their mother. The case didn't go to a full trial. Faced with the forged documents, the financial records, and a fraudulent medical letter tied to a doctor already under federal investigation, Rachel's attorney negotiated a plea. She pleaded guilty to financial exploitation of an elderly person and forgery. The judge, a woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt, sentenced her to 18 months with the possibility of an earlier release for good behavior, plus 5 years of probation and full restitution money I will likely never fully see, but that was never really the point. Before sentencing, Rachel was allowed to speak. She turned around in the courtroom and looked at me for the first time since Fairhaven, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, and said, "Dad, I know sorry isn't enough." I panicked, and I told myself a story where hurting you was somehow the lesser evil. I know now there wasn't a version of this where it was okay. I didn't say anything back. I couldn't. I just nodded, once, and let her see that I'd heard her, because that was the only thing I had left to give her in that room. I moved out of the house Doris and I had shared, not because Rachel had tried to sell it, but because after everything, it felt too big and too full of ghosts for one man to rattle around in alone. I bought a small 2-bedroom condo 15 minutes from Mia's apartment, close enough that we started having dinner together twice a week, something we'd never managed to do even when we lived in the same town before. I started seeing a counselor, a quiet, patient man named Dr. Halloran, who helped me understand that what Rachel did to me wasn't a referendum on my worth as a father, that a person in enough fear and enough debt can convince themselves of almost anything, and that the convincing itself doesn't make the damage any less real, but it does mean the damage isn't a mirror held up to me. I still see Eli and Josie. That was one of the first things I insisted on once the dust settled, that whatever happened between Rachel and me, I was not going to disappear from my grandchildren's lives the way I'd nearly been made to disappear from my own. I picked Josie up from soccer practice on Thursdays now. Eli, who's 16 and mostly monosyllabic the way 16-year-old boys are supposed to be, has started asking me to teach him how the accounting business actually works, which I take as the closest thing to affection a boy his age is willing to show his grandfather. I wrote Rachel a letter about 4 months into her sentence. It took me 3 tries to get it right, and even then I'm not sure I did. I told her I forgave her, not because what she did was forgivable in the way you'd forgive a missed birthday or a harsh word, but because I decided a long time ago, back when Doris died and I had to choose between bitterness and living, that I wasn't going to spend whatever years I had left carrying something that heavy. I told her I loved her, that I loved her children, and that when she got out, there would be a door open, though I couldn't promise yet what would be on the other side of it. Trust, I told her, isn't something you get back just because time has passed. It's something you rebuild one honest year at a time, and we were, at best, still standing at the very beginning of that road. It's been a little over a year now since that morning at the airport when my daughter hugged me too long and told me she loved me while planning to erase me from my own life. I still think about the woman I saw in Fairhaven's lobby that day, the one with her palm against the glass, watching the parking lot for someone who never came, and I wonder sometimes whether anyone ever did come for her, or whether she's still there, still waiting. I think about her more than I think about the money, if I'm honest, because the money came back and the house never sold and every legal thread got untangled in the end. But that woman at the window stays with me, because I understand now, in a way I didn't before all this happened, exactly how a person ends up in a place like that, not always because they're forgotten, but sometimes because someone who claimed to love them decided their own fear mattered more. I go fishing now, actually, for real, most Saturday mornings at a reservoir 20 minutes from my condo, alone with a thermos of coffee and the sound of nothing in particular. Mia teases me that I finally got my lake house, just 72 years old and one betrayal too late, on my own terms instead of someone else's. She's not wrong. I sit out there some mornings and I think about Doris, and about Rachel, and about how strange it is that the daughter who tried to erase me and the granddaughter who refused to let it happen came from the exact same family, the exact same love, grown in 2 completely different directions. I don't have an answer for why people turn out the way they do. I've stopped looking for one. An IGA, the basic van. What I have instead is a grandson who wants to learn my trade, a granddaughter who broke a speed limit to save me, and a Saturday morning with a fishing line in still water. And, at 72 years old, after everything, I've decided that's more than enough to call a good life.